Henry Fonda told his children their mother died of a heart attack. He looked at a 12-year-old and a 10-year-old and said the word. He held to it. He arranged a funeral attended by 2 people, himself and his mother-in-law, and then moved forward. 8 months later, he married a 21-year-old woman. The children learned the truth the way children should never learn anything, from strangers. A classmate passed a celebrity magazine across a desk in study hall. There it was. Their mother had not died of a heart attack. She had died alone in a sanatorium in Beacon, New York, with a razor she had smuggled from her own house, carried past a trained nurse who saw nothing, while her children were upstairs playing jacks. She had written 6 notes before she did it. Not one was addressed to Henry Fonda. He was not in the will either. She had cut him from both the letters and the estate before she walked into that bathroom on the morning of her 42nd birthday. The question this story asks is not what Frances did. That is known. The question is what Henry Fonda knew when he knew it, and what he did after she was gone to make sure no one examined any of it carefully. Someone should have looked. For a very long time, almost nobody did. They almost kept it hidden. Old Money tragedy shows how close exposure came, and what it cost her either way. Subscribe so the traces are never lost. Frances Ford Seymour was born on April 4, 1908, in Brockville, Ontario, Canada. Her father was a lawyer. Her lineage, on his side, traced back to Edward Seymour, 1st Duke of Somerset, whose sister Jane Seymour had been the 3rd wife of Henry VIII. Frances grew up with the particular awareness that comes from old families who have maintained their names while losing their money. That a woman's standing is determined almost entirely by the man she attaches herself to, and that the work of a life is to attach herself to the right one. She was skilled at this. She was ALS. Oh, beneath the social competence, carrying something that nobody in her adult world fully understood, because she had never been able to name it, and because the world she moved through had not given her any reason to try. According to her daughter Jane, who gained access to Frances's psychiatric records in 2005, with the help of lawyers, while writing her memoir, Frances had been a victim of recurrent childhood sexual abuse beginning when she was approximately 8 years old. Incestuous abuse. In Ontario. In a household that presented nothing but respectability to the world outside it. This fact was buried so completely that Jane herself did not know it until she was 57 years old, reading a medical file in a lawyer's office. When she read it, she said, "The minute I read that, everything fell into place. The promiscuity, the plastic surgeries, 9 of them, the guilt that clung to Frances without apparent origin, the inability to be intimate that Jane had, as a child, experienced simply as her mother not being there. Frances had been carrying that wound for 30 years before she died. Nobody in the social world she inhabited had known it was there. The wound was the foundational concealment, the one that preceded everything else, the one that made every other form of hiding both possible and necessary. She came to New York as a young woman and moved with the confidence of someone who had learned to show nothing. At 22, she married George Tuttle Brokaw, a millionaire lawyer and sportsman who was 51 years old. They married in January 1931. Their daughter, Frances de Villers Brokaw, called Always Pan, was born that October. Brokaw died of a heart attack in 1935. Frances inherited his estate. She was 27, wealthy, and outwardly unencumbered. In early 1936, she traveled to England with a friend and visited Denham Film Studios, where an American actor named Henry Fonda was working on a production called Wings of the Morning. He was 30 years old. He had recently ended a marriage to actress Margaret Sullivan, a marriage that had lasted less than 2 years and that those close to him described as turbulent. The courtship that followed the meeting at Denham was brief. They married in September 1936 at Christ Church in New York City. Frances relocated to Hollywood. Jane was born in December 1937. Peter arrived in February 1940. From the outside, it looked precisely as it was supposed to look. A beautiful socialite with excellent lineage and a well-managed fortune. A famous actor building one of the most morally serious careers in Hollywood. Connecticut house. Children. What was being hidden beneath that surface was this. Henry Fonda was not emotionally present in that marriage. not at the beginning, and less as the years accumulated. This is not a retrospective judgment by someone who disagreed with his choices. It is in the clinical record. Dr. Margaret Gibson, the psychiatrist who treated Francis at Austin Riggs Center, described Henry Fonda after his wife's death with the precision of a professional who had spent months hearing evidence. He was a cold, self-absorbed person, a complete narcissist. She was not speculating from the outside. She had the records of what Francis had described across months of inpatient treatment, the daily texture of the marriage, what it had contained, what it had not. That assessment, entered into a medical file, is what a trained professional concluded from direct observation of the evidence. Francis was managing what we would now recognize as bipolar disorder, though in the 1940s neither the language nor the effective treatments were available to her. What she had instead was a diagnosis that carried profound social stigma, a history of episodes that required periodic hospitalization, and a husband who was, by every available account, emotionally unreachable. She managed her illness inside a structure, marriage, celebrity, motherhood, Connecticut house, that was not designed to support her and was operated by a man who had made a private determination, years before he said it, that the marriage was over. What the children were never told was the truth of their mother's deterioration. When Francis's episodes required intervention, which happened with increasing frequency through the mid to late 1940s, Jane and Peter were told their mother was away. Not where, not why. Jane has said in interviews that she grew up not knowing her mother. Not because Francis was absent, but because she had been raised, without knowing it, to experience her mother's illness as abandonment. She was angry at Francis. She had been made to be, through the managed silence inside that house. The children's own anger at their mother was itself a product of what had been kept from them. What the press and public did not know was the affair. By at least 1948, Henry Fonda was involved with Susan Blanchard, stepdaughter of Oscar Hammerstein II. She was born in March 1928. Henry Fonda was born in May 1905. When the affair began, she was 20 years old and he was 43. Francis had been born in 1908, making Susan Blanchard 20 years younger than the wife she was displacing, and 23 years younger than the man she was with. He had selected a woman young enough to be his daughter. What Francis herself was never told, the cruelest withholding of all, was that the decision had already been made. She did not know that the affair had been running for a year before he told her. She did not know that while she was managing her illness and trying to hold the marriage together, he had already, privately, left it. She was maintaining something that had already been abandoned. The final year of her marriage was spent fighting for a structure that the other person had already vacated. Something was moving toward the surface. It had been moving for some time. The question was not whether it would break through, but when, and who would be in the room when it did. The answer is not complicated, but it is specific, and the specificity matters. Henry Fonda needed the concealment to hold, not simply to protect his career, though the career was significant. What he needed hidden was more precise than that. The gap between the man the public had been paying to see on screen and the man who had been living in that house in Connecticut. By 1949, Henry Fonda was one of the most morally legible actors in Hollywood. This was not accidental, it was the product of deliberate role selection, of a public image built across a decade of playing men defined by their decency. Tom Joad in The Grapes of Wrath, standing up for the dispossessed. Abraham Lincoln in Young Mr. Lincoln, embodying American moral clarity. Wyatt Earp in My Darling Clementine. Frank James. Gil Carter in The Oxbow Incident, a man who watches an injustice happen and cannot stop it and is destroyed by having watched. Fonda had made a career of playing the man in the room who knew what was right. That image was the foundation of everything he had built. And that image was the specific thing that exposure threatened. Not an affair in isolation, the studio system had managed worse. What exposure would have cost him was the combination. The affair with a woman 23 years his junior, begun while his wife was already visibly unwell, 13 years of documented emotional coldness toward that wife, and, most critically, the sequence of events following his announcement in August 1949. Because what happened after he told Francis was not quiet or contained. She collapsed in a way that required outside institutions, outside documentation, outside professionals who were forming clinical opinions about what had caused the collapse. Those opinions existed in writing. They named him. They described him in language that was the precise opposite of every role he had ever been paid to play. He understood the exposure risk. He had have understood it. The specific moment he grasped how close things had come was when Frances's deterioration made household management impossible, when she required inpatient psychiatric treatment and there were people beyond the marriage who were now hearing her account of it. People professionally obligated to listen to patients. People who kept records. People whose job was to understand causes, not just symptoms. The public image of Henry Fonda rested on decency. The private record assembling itself inside Austin Riggs was the clinical documentation of its absence. He had more to lose from exposure than she did. That is what made him dangerous. What it also meant, and this is the part that the official record does not state but that the sequence of his actions makes clear, is that every decision he made after August 1949 was made with that vulnerability in mind. The private funeral, the 2 attendees, the lie to the children, the speed of the remarriage. None of it was grief. All of it was management. The first time it became imminent, it moved slowly, almost imperceptibly. Through the mid to late 1940s, Frances's mental health episodes were becoming more frequent, harder to contain, and generating a widening circle of witnesses. She was seeking treatment. She was cycling in and out of stability and patterns that were visible to domestic staff, social acquaintances, teachers at the children's schools, anyone in their orbit who was paying attention. The household was not invisible, they were the Fondas, and people noticed things. Henry Fonda's response to this first accumulation of risk was the tool he used for most problems. Absence. He worked. He was away on productions. He was not present for the interior of the marriage, and his absence functioned, paradoxically, as a form of protection for his image. If he was not there, he was not witnessing. If he was not witnessing, the question of his responsibility could not easily be raised. The crisis stayed inside the house, managed by Frances with staff. His public image remained intact. The surface closed over it. For a while, the second approach was closer and it came all at once. In August 1949, Fonda sat down with Frances and told her he wanted a divorce. He did not stop there. He told her why, that he wanted to marry Susan Blanchard. He put both facts into the same conversation. By accounts close to the situation, he delivered this with characteristic flatness, not cruelty as performance, but the efficiency of a man who considered the marriage already concluded and the conversation merely procedural. Frances received it as what it was, the destruction of everything she had been holding together. By January 1950, 5 months after that conversation, she was admitted to Austin Riggs Psychiatric Center in Stockbridge, Massachusetts. Before her admission, accounts indicate she had thrown her wedding ring from a window and then tried to follow it. That is in the record. She was so severely deteriorated that inpatient treatment was the only available option. The household management that had contained everything for years had failed completely. What stopped this second approach from becoming full public exposure was her removal from circulation. Inside Austin Riggs, Frances was a patient. Her account of the 13 years, her version of what had happened, her description of who Henry Fonda had been inside that marriage. All of it stayed within institutional walls. Dr. Gibson was hearing it. But clinical confidentiality meant it went nowhere outside. The surface closed over it. Again. But at a cost. And with something new in the record that had not been there before. The third approach was the closest of all. It came in early April 1950. The staff at Craig House, where Frances had been transferred, believed she was improving. She had convinced them. On a supervised home visit, she came to the family house with a nurse. The children were upstairs. Their grandmother called them down. Jane would not come. Peter followed her lead. Frances stood in the hallway. Then she went upstairs, not to the children's room, but to her bedroom. She was there only a few minutes. She came back down. She was calm. The nurse observed nothing unusual. What happened in those minutes is in the record. She had retrieved a razor from the house. She concealed it on her person before returning downstairs. She concealed it so completely, so calmly, that a professional whose entire purpose was to observe her noticed nothing at all. The third time, it was seconds from breaking the surface entirely. And what stopped it, in those seconds, was not anyone else's action. It was Francis deciding. The first suppression required almost nothing. That is the point, because the ease of it reveals how early the machinery of concealment had become structural, and how little it cost Henry Fonda to maintain. In the early years of the marriage, keeping Francis's mental health struggles from public view was accomplished through the ordinary instruments of wealth and celebrity. Domestic staff trained in discretion by decades of working in households where discretion was currency. Social circles that managed private information as a reflex. A studio system that had institutionalized the protection of its investments' personal lives as a matter of financial self-interest. Henry Fonda's public image did the rest. Nobody was looking for trouble inside a marriage that looked correct. And what nobody looked for, nobody found. The cost of this first suppression was not paid by Henry Fonda. It was paid by Francis in the currency she had in most abundance. Isolation. The more her illness was handled quietly, kept inside the house, described to the children as absence, managed through staff rather than through any open acknowledgement of what was happening, the more completely alone she became with it. The people who might have understood, who might have applied outside pressure to the conditions inside that marriage, remained at a comfortable remove maintained by the same machinery that was protecting Fonda's career. She deteriorated quietly, inside a household that had become expert at looking fine to anyone who looked from outside. The second suppression required something the first had not, an active and sustained construction of meaning. When Francis's collapse after August 1949 made hospitalization unavoidable, when the crisis exceeded what household management could contain, what was needed was a frame. The frame was accurate as far as it went. Francis had a long-standing mental illness, and she had been admitted to a psychiatric facility for treatment. This was true. It was also carefully incomplete. Her psychiatrist believed that Henry Fonda's behavior had materially worsened her condition. That clinical judgment was real. It was documented. It existed inside a file at Austin Riggs. But it did not exist in any public account, because clinical files are confidential, and Henry Fonda made no statements that would have invited anyone to look for one. What the second suppression required from Fonda was something he found natural. Silence. He did not need to lie about the hospitalization. He needed only to say nothing that would complicate the frame, nothing that would raise the question of what had preceded January 1950, nothing that would prompt the press to think about the August 1949 conversation and its aftermath as cause and effect. And because Henry Fonda was, as Dr. Gibson's file would later confirm, primarily oriented toward his own interests, silence was not difficult. What this second suppression took from Francis was her voice. Not through direct silencing, nobody told her she couldn't speak. But inside the framing of her as patient, her account of the marriage became clinical material rather than testimony. What she said about the 13 years was processed as symptom, not fact. She was the one who was ill. An ill woman's description of her husband was, within that frame, already categorized before it was heard. She paid for this suppression with the public record of her own experience. The third suppression cost more than the first two combined, and it produced consequences that lasted decades. On April 14, 1950, Francis was found in her bathroom at Craig House. She had written 6 notes that morning, addressed them, sealed them. She had thought through what needed to be said. Then she used the razor she had kept hidden since the home visit. Henry Fonda moved with notable speed. The funeral was arranged within days. 2 attendees, himself and Sophie Seymour, Francis's mother. 2. Not a small gathering of close friends. Not even the immediate family of 3 children she had left behind. 2 people in the middle of an afternoon, for a woman who had been a prominent socialite, the wife of one of the most famous actors in America, the mother of 3 children who would themselves become famous. 2 people, and then it was over, and there was no public forum, no gathering of the people who had known Francis, who had witnessed the marriage in any form, who might have spoken to each other or to anyone outside about what those 13 years had actually contained. He told the children, heart attack. He said this deliberately. He maintained it. He knew it would eventually break. Celebrity marriages were covered, and Francis's death had been noted, and the true cause would surface somewhere. He told the lie anyway. He told it to a 12-year-old girl and a 10-year-old boy and left it with them. The lie held for approximately 1 year. Then a classmate slid a magazine across a desk in a Connecticut study hall. And Jane Fonda read what had actually happened to her mother in the language of celebrity gossip while sitting at a school desk. She was 13. She read it. She went home with it. She would tell interviewers, decades later, what she had immediately concluded. That if she had gone downstairs that afternoon in April, her mother would have lived. That the refusal to come down from the room where she was playing jacks had been the thing that killed Frances Seymour. That it was her fault. She carried this. Through her adolescence, through the eating disorder that developed in those years, through her first marriage, through the decades of trying to be enough for a father who was himself, by clinical record, not equipped to provide what she was looking for. She carried guilt that had been placed there by a lie told by a man who had arranged a private funeral for the woman the lie was about. Henry Fonda did not correct it. The third suppression produced something the first two had not. It transferred the moral weight of Frances's death onto her daughter. It took the guilt that might reasonably have belonged somewhere else and placed it, precisely and for decades, inside a 12-year-old. What the act of concealment produced, beyond the immediate prevention of exposure, was a record more damning than any press story would have been. The two-person funeral. The false cause of death. The remarriage 8 months later. The 6 notes addressed to everyone but him. The will that removed his name. Frances could not speak publicly about what the marriage had been. But every decision she made in the final hours of her life was its own statement, and the statements she made were specific. By the end, what had been spent to prevent exposure was itself the exposure. Anyone looking at the cost could see exactly what had needed hiding. Frances knew the marriage had been empty long before she knew the name Susan Blanchard. She had been living inside the evidence for years. Henry Fonda's emotional unavailability was not a secret he kept from her. It was the central condition of the household. The weather inside the house that she navigated daily and managed quietly and did not name outside. She was not deceived about the marriage. She was managed. Within it, there is a difference, and it mattered for what she did next. When the formal notification came, when he sat down and named his mistress and announced his intentions, what she did was not the silence it appeared from outside. She did not go to the press. She made no public statements. She went inward. She collapsed inward, thoroughly and completely, in a way that required professional intervention. But inside that inwardness, she was not passive. She was thinking. The 6 notes she left on the morning of April 14th, 1950 are not fully known in their content. They were addressed to her mother Sophie, to Pan, to others whose identities have not all been made public. What is conspicuous, what every account notes because it cannot be overlooked, is that not one of them was addressed to Henry Fonda. She sat with her paper and thought carefully about who deserved a letter. She had things to say to some people. She had nothing she would put in writing to him. The absence of his name among those 6 addresses was not an accident of grief. It was a decision made with the same deliberateness she brought to the will. What she knew next, what accumulated in the months inside Austin Riggs, was a clearer view of her own situation than she had managed to form inside the marriage. In treatment with a psychiatrist who was not his ally, whose professional obligation was to Frances, she was in an environment where her account of the marriage could be received as an account. Dr. Gibson heard it. Whatever Frances described in those sessions, the coldness, the absence, the affair, the manner in which the announcement had been delivered, Dr. Gibson heard it and formed a professional judgment from it. That judgment, cold, self-absorbed, a complete narcissist, came from somewhere specific. Came from Frances. And it was written down. That written record is the most durable thing Frances produced with what she knew. Survived her. It survived the private funeral and tea. He lie told to the children and the remarriage 8 months later. It is still in the file. It surfaces every time someone looks carefully at this story. What she did with the combination of her knowledge, the affair, the years of coldness, the clinical clarity that treatment provided, was make precise decisions about what she would leave behind and what she would withhold. The estate, his name removed. The final letters, his name absent. These were not impulsive acts. A woman in the depths of a psychiatric crisis does not revise a legal document with the kind of precision that holds up. She was thinking clearly enough in whatever time and space was available to her to do what needed doing. She controlled those two instruments, the will and the letters, and she used both of them to say what her circumstances had not allowed her to say while she was alive. What she chose not to do is the detail that tells the most. She could have spoken publicly. She was still, in early 1950, the wife of Henry Fonda, and that fact would have given her immediate access to press attention if she had wanted it. A prominent socialite, twice married, describing the interior of a 13-year marriage to one of Hollywood's most morally celebrated actors. That was a story in 1950. The press would have printed it. She did not pursue it. She chose her children over the record. If she had gone public, if she had given interviews, made statements, described the 13 years in detail, Jane and Peter would have grown up inside that story. They would have been the children of the scandal, the children of the exposure, their childhood refracted permanently through what their mother had said and what their father had done. Frances saw that. She understood it. And she went inside, into the institutions, into the clinical confidentiality that kept her account contained, and she protected them from it by saying nothing to anyone who could repeat it publicly. That choice cost her the PUBL. I see record. It is why this story spent 75 years being told primarily in Henry Fonda's version. The version in which Frances was a troubled woman whose illness finally overwhelmed her, and in which Fonda was a husband who had done his difficult best. It is why Jane Fonda had to retrieve her mother's actual account from a psychiatric file, with lawyers at the age of 57, while writing a memoir. Frances paid for her children's protection with her own history. She traded the record of what happened to her for the childhood she wanted them to have. The trade was made without their knowledge, and they did not discover the terms of it until they were adults. She knew exactly what she was protecting. She knew exactly what it would cost. What she did with knowing, that is the part nobody recorded. On the morning of April 14, 1950, Frances Ford Seymour Fonda was found in her bathroom at Craig House Sanitarium in Beacon, New York. It was her 42nd birthday. She had written 6 notes before she went into the bathroom. They were sealed and addressed. She had thought through what needed to be said, to whom, and had said it. Then she was finished with that work, and she went in. The razor she used had been in her possession for 10 days, retrieved from her bedroom during the supervised home visit, carried past a trained nurse who noticed nothing, kept hidden at Craig House until the morning she used it. She had planned this with the same quiet competence she had applied to the will and the letters. Nothing was impulsive. Everything was decided. What broke the surface was not the exposure that had been building toward it. It was not the press story, not a divorce proceeding, not a public account of what the marriage had been. The thing that finally broke through was the death itself. The death in the institution on her birthday with 6 notes addressed to everyone but him. Henry Fonda moved quickly. The funeral was arranged within days. 2 attendees. Himself and Sophie Seymour, Frances's mother. No extended gathering, no public service, no space in which anyone who had known Frances could say anything to anyone. It was over before it could produce a record. He told the children, heart attack. He said this to a 12-year-old and a 10-year-old and held the story for approximately 1 year. Then a classmate passed Jane a celebrity magazine across a study hall desk in Connecticut. Jane read what had actually happened to her mother while sitting at school. In the language of gossip, surrounded by people who knew who her father was. She read it. She returned to her house carrying that knowledge, carrying also the conclusion that calcified immediately and held for years, that if she had gone downstairs that afternoon in April, her mother would have lived. That the refusal to come down from the room where she was playing jacks had been the thing that killed Frances Seymour. That it was her fault. Henry Fonda did not correct it. Now return to the cold open. Return to the hallway. A woman who has already gone upstairs and come back down. Who is standing, composed, in the hallway of her own house while a nurse stands beside her and a grandmother calls up an empty staircase. She is carrying something concealed. She has been carrying it for 10 days. The nurse sees nothing wrong. What Frances was holding in that hallway was not just a razor. It was a decision already made, settled, complete, carried inside the performed composure of a woman who had spent her entire adult life learning to show nothing that might be used against her. She had learned this as a girl in Ontario, in a household that presented nothing but respectability. She had applied it every day of her marriage. She was applying it now for the last time in her own hallway, while her daughter played jacks one floor above her. What that moment cost her was 42 years. What it cost Jane was decades of misplaced guilt and a truth discovered in a magaz. What it cost Henry Fonda, publicly, professionally, immediately, was almost nothing at all. He married Susan Blanchard on December 27, 1950, 8 months after Frances died, in a ceremony at the New York home of Oscar Hammerstein II. That marriage lasted 6 years. He married an Italian baroness, after a Franchetti, in 1957. That lasted 4 years. He married Shirley May Adams in 1965. She was with him when he died of heart failure in Los Angeles on August 12, 1982. 5 wives. He outlived Frances by 32 years. Frances had 1 widowhood and 1 marriage. She did not survive the ending of the marriage by 12 months. The suppression was almost perfect. What it left behind, in the official record, in the clinical file, in the unofficial account Jane Fonda has spent her adult life assembling, and in what is conspicuously absent from all of these, is more than Henry Fonda intended. In the official record, the timeline is its own indictment. Frances Seymour Fonda died on April 14, 1950, at Craig House Sanitarium, Beacon, New York. Self-inflicted wound. The death record exists. The coroner's documentation exists. What exists alongside it, in a different archive, is the sequence. August 1949. Fonda tells Frances he is leaving and names his mistress. January 1950. Frances is admitted to Austin Riggs, so severely deteriorated that she had tried to exit a window. April 1950. She is dead. The official record does not draw a line between these events. It does not need to. Anyone who reads them in order draws the line themselves. In the clinical record, there is Dr. Margaret Gibson's assessment, entered into Frances's treatment file at Austin Riggs, not into any public-facing document. The words are specific. He was a cold, self-absorbed person, a complete narcissist. A medical professional's conclusion, derived from direct clinical evidence, placed into an institutional record. It is still there. It was not placed there to surface. It surfaces anyway, because Jane Fonda found it and because Jane Fonda speaks. In the unofficial record, there is Jane herself, the most durable trace Frances left, and the one Henry Fonda could not manage. Jane has given interviews. She wrote a memoir in 2005. She made an HBO documentary. She accessed her mother's psychiatric records and found documented evidence of childhood abuse that she said explained everything she had not understood about her mother. The surgeries, the guilt, the inability to be intimate, the sense that Frances was somehow absent even when she was present. Jane put it into print. Anyone who wants to find Frances's actual voice, her account of what she was carrying, where it came from, what it produced, can find it, refracted through her daughter's words, in Jane's own books and interviews and documentary footage. In what is absent, the most specific trace of all. His name is not on the 6 notes. He was not among the people Frances chose to address in the final hours of her life. She made deliberate decisions about who warranted a letter. She had things to say to some people and nothing she would put in writing to him. The absence is precise. It is not the absence of someone overlooked in grief. It is the absence of someone excluded with intent. He is also absent from the will. I found the trace in the public accounts, material available all along, in documents never sealed, in records that have been accessible to anyone who looked carefully enough. The trace was there, pointing directly at what had almost broken through the surface and what had been done to keep it submerged. The clearest trace is this. Before she died, Frances Ford Seymour Fonda revised her estate to exclude Henry Fonda's name. He had been conducting an affair since at least 1948. He had told her to her face that he was leaving for a woman 23 years younger. He had delivered this information to a woman he had spent 13 years emotionally neglecting, a woman whose illness he had watched worsen, whose hospitalization he managed as a framing problem, whose children he had told she died of a heart attack. She removed him from the will. She wrote 6 letters and addressed none to him. She left him no part of herself. Not her estate, not her final words, not a single sentence. He received nothing from her. Not one